The theory of rate of interest plays a significant role in our day-to-day lives because it is everywhere you go. You go to a bank or you go to a financial institution and you see this word interest rate and the symbol percentage everywhere. And especially if you're trying to study economics at a higher level and studying core finance, interest rate plays a pivotal role in understanding the higher level concepts which are introduced to you in college level courses. So, rate of interest, let's try to understand this using two perspectives. Rate of interest offers two perspectives. The first one is the borrower's perspective. And the second one is what I like to call the lender's perspective. Now, what does interest rate mean from both of these POVs, both of these perspectives? Let's try to understand it. From the borrower's perspective, interest rate means cost of borrowing. That is, it is the price you have to pay to borrow something. Simply said. So if I have to borrow something from a bank, it is the price I will have to pay as an excess amount for that borrowing. From the lender's perspective, interest rate is nothing but rate of return. So it is the reward that investors or anyone who wishes to deposit or even park their money in financial institutions like bank get. So it is an incentive for them to park their deposits in banks or any financial institutions likewise. Now let's try to understand the borrower's perspective and the lender's perspective in detail. Now when I speak of the borrower, I'll try to explain it using an example. Let's assume you want to start hitting the gym and you realize that the closest gym and the best gym in your proximity costs $1,500 per session, and unfortunately you have only $1,000, so you need an extra $500 to start the gym membership. So naturally you approach the bank for a loan of $500, and the bank does give you the loan of $500, but on one condition though. It won't give you the $500 for free because it also needs money. It also needs to be profitable, otherwise it's not going to have the sufficient fund that it needs to operate on a daily basis. So this money, this profit that banks earn is called as the rate of interest. So it is the cost of borrowing essentially, which can be 10% or it can be 10% or 12% or whatever it may be. It depends on the financial institution. Let's assume it is 10% in our case, the rate of interest per annum. Per annum basically means it is 10% for 1 year. So if I repay the amount of $500 after 1 year, I will have to pay 10% of $500, which is $50. And if I repay it in 2 years time, I will have to pay 10% of $500 for 1 year, that is the first year, and 10% of $500 for the second year, provided I'm using compound interest method. Sorry, I'm using simple interest method, not compound interest method. So assuming the repayment period is 1 year for simplicity, that is I'm repaying the money in 1 year's time, I will have to pay the principal amount, which is just a fancy word for the original amount which you borrowed, that is the amount for which you took the loan for in the first place. So the principal amount plus, that is $500, plus the interest amount, which is in this case 10%, so it's going to be $50. 10% of $500, $50. So it's going to be $550. That is the total amount I have to pay to the bank after 1 year. So in this case, the cost of borrowing was $50. That is, the interest rate I had to pay was $50. That is 10%. So that is the cost of borrowing from the borrower's perspective. Now, when we try to explain the lender's perspective, you can think of an investor who has a lot of money in his bank. Let's say he has $100,000 lying around in his bank account. And a normal individual, he has many options using which he can spend this money. Like, he can use this for paying off debt, he can use this for consumption, that is, he can purchase the things he wants to, and he can even just simply hold this cash, right? He can hold this money in his house or anywhere he wishes to. But let's say he wishes to invest a portion of this money into a financial institution like bank. So how will bank encourage or, in a way, motivate this person? How will a bank motivate this investor or encourage this investor to invest a portion of their money into their institution? They do this with the help of rate of interest. And as we spoke earlier, rate of interest from the lender's perspective is nothing but rate of return. So if I'm wishing to spend $10,000 of my money as savings into a bank, and I get, let's suppose, 10% of interest rate per annum, I'm expecting to get 10% of my initial investment, that is my principal amount, each year as a reward. So what does this mean? It means after one year, I'm going to get $1,000, which is 10% of $10,000. After 2 years, I'm going to get $1,000 again. So total will be $2,000. After 3 years, that is for the third year, I'm going to get $1,000 again. So all of this amount that you're seeing over here is nothing but the rate of return. It is the reward I'm getting from the investment. So from the lender's perspective, it is nothing but the incentive, the reward that the investor earns after investing, after depositing or parking his money in a financial institution. And it is the single best way to encourage, or as we learned here, to motivate the investor to park his funds in a financial institution like bank. Now that we've studied the borrower's perspective and the lender's perspective of rate of interest, let's try to understand the economic significance this theory has. Now try to think of yourself as an economist who is making decisions for the entire country. And we'll take two situations into consideration. The first situation is when there is hyperinflation in the country. So in the first situation, there is hyperinflation, and as we know, in an inflation, there is a rise in prices, rise in general price level of goods and services. So rise in prices accompanied by rise in income levels, so rise in income, which all ultimately results in increased consumption. So these are the pillars of an inflation facing economy. Now try to think of this situation from the lens of an economist. When you think of this hyperinflated situation, you would realize that during inflation, there is a rise in price level, there is a rise in income, and there is a rise in consumption. So your objective as an economist to steer the economy out of hyperinflation should be to decrease prices of goods, right? And it should be to decrease consumption, thereby reducing the aggregate demand and putting it at a place where it's controllable and manageable for the economy. So how can you do this just with rate of interest? Well, using rate of interest, using interest rates, you can manage the supply of money people have. Try to think of this. If ROI, which is the rate of interest, increases, the cost of borrowing, which is COB, would increase too. And if the cost of borrowing increases, it is evident that borrowings become costlier, which means people would borrow less, and which fundamentally means purchasing power would reduce. And that is the main goal of an economist during hyperinflation, right? It's to reduce the purchasing power of individuals so that they can control the consumption levels and steer the economy to a more stable state. Now let's really try to understand how an economy can be steered away from a recession or something like a depression. As we know that during depression, there is a fall in prices accompanied by fall in income, that is fall in purchasing power, and also decreased consumption levels. Now, really try to think of this situation. Really try to put yourself in the shoes of an economist and come up with a conclusion as to how you can steer the economy out of a depression just by using rate of interest as a mechanism. Try to think of it for a second. Well, as you know, for inflation, we used the increased interest rate as a mechanism for increasing the cost of borrowings and thereby reducing purchasing power of consumers. Now for depression, it's no different, just that it's done in an opposite fashion. That is, during depression, we decrease the rate of interest. So if you could come up with this with your own, it's pretty good stuff, because with depressed economies, we just decrease the rate of interest, which would thereby decrease the cost of borrowings, right? Borrowings would become cheaper, they would become more lucrative. Let's say my interest rate decreased from 10% to let's say 7%. That means before I was borrowing something and I had to repay 10% of the principal amount. Now I'm borrowing something and I have to repay only 7% of the total principal amount, which is amazing for the borrower, right? Amazing for the person who needs money. And the person who needs money, when he gets money at a more lucrative fashion, what will happen is people would get more money, they would borrow more, they would take loans more, and as a consequence, the purchasing power which people have would drastically increase, right? It would drastically increase because people are borrowing more, people are getting money more easily, right? So it makes sense that people's purchasing power would increase, and as a consequence, their consumption levels would rise because they have more purchasing power. So if their consumption levels rises, we would know that the economy would be steering its way from depression to stable economy, because aggregate demand rises. That is, the total level of demand in a country rises as a whole with rise in consumption levels. So that was a very simplistic model on how rate of interest could be used as a mechanism or as a tool for steering the economy away from state of extremes like hyperinflation or depression to a more relatively stable state. For hyperinflation, we would increase the interest rate because cost of borrowings would increase in that fashion, and similarly, as a consequence, purchasing power would decrease. For depression, rate of interest should decrease because cost of borrowings as a consequence would decrease and purchasing power would increase. It would become more lucrative, it would become more cheaper in comparison to other forms of borrowing mechanisms, such as borrowing it from informal means or something. So consumption would increase and people would purchase more, and as a consequence, aggregate demand would increase.